Growth Unleashed.
Structural deficit. What is it and what does it mean for the average Pennsylvanian?
Structural deficit is really easy. It is spending more than what you bring in revenue. So your expenses exceed the amount of money you have available to pay for those expenses. So recurring costs, recurring expenses. And that's where we're at in Pennsylvania. We had a structural deficit before COVID. We got billions of federal dollars to help deal with coronavirus. Basically, we supplanted state funds. We now have a surplus, but it's one-time dollars. We're not gaining revenue hand over foot to cover expenses as the growth. So we're currently back to operating as a structural deficit. The unique aspect, though, is we're the closest we've ever been to closing out that structural deficit if we maintain good financial discipline this budget year. Unfortunately, the governor has proposed a budget that spends $3 billion more in recurring expenses than we have available in revenue, which means next year you have to backfill the $3 billion to bring it up to current level. And then you need to do additional spending because people ask for more money. There's cost to carry programs because of inflation and adding people to Medicaid rolls, a whole nine yards. There's increased costs year over year. Right now we're sitting on over $6 billion in a budget surplus. We have $6 billion in our rainy day fund, which by law is designated for an economic emergency. And if we do the governor's budget, all of that surplus will be eviscerated in a few short fiscal years, and we'll have a multi-billion-dollar deficit of which we can't pay the bills, so it's going to require a tax increase. So if you spend more than what you have, you create a structural deficit. If you cut taxes and don't reduce spending, you create a structural deficit. So it works both ways. The worst thing you could do is spend more money and cut taxes simultaneously. That will grow your gap even faster.
So what about people that say, okay, but in the future we're going to bring in more money because we're investing?
It really doesn't work that way. Right now our economic growth is at, tax revenues at like 0.4% growth, right? During COVID, we saw a mass influx of revenue because of inflation, like sales tax were booming, corporate taxes were booming. But that's not a normal revenue tax generation year over year growth for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We're a very moderate growth state when it comes to revenue. By throwing more money out there, you're not going to magically see all this revenue. Even if you cut taxes and give more money to people, you're not going to see this massive revenue growth or this massive growth in sales and use tax and stuff like that. It just doesn't happen. You'll see some, but it's not some massive growth that's going to cover the cost of a major spending or major tax cut unless you manage the budget moving forward. It's the only way to really do both. You have to manage. If you want to do major spending, you have to have major tax increases to cover it. If you want to do major tax cuts, you have to have major expenditure reductions. You got to cut spending to cut taxes. You've got to increase taxes to spend more money.
So you kind of identified the problem, the structural deficit. What is your plan to try and fix it that doesn't involve all these other pitfalls that you've been describing?
Yeah, I think number one, we need to start with zero-based budgeting. Have every single state agency go back to zero and rebuild their budgets on the actual need and the core functions of what their job duties are. We have a lot of programs, a lot of spending that have been just caked into the budget decades after decades. Two, we need to get back to basics. So all these state agencies have the new shiny things they want to do, but they fail to do the basic job duties that they were created to do in the first place. So we need to refocus these state agencies on their basic job duties and reinforce those structures because they are failing the citizens of the Commonwealth every single day because they're not focused on those basic duties. And they want to do all these new things, all these new shiny programs that ultimately amount to us spending more money and getting zero results.
Growth Unleashed.